Now, this week's historic vote to allow same-sex marriage makes New Zealand the 13th country in the world to do so. The mainstream media's coverage was generally one of celebration. So how did our Christian media cover this story? Our media panel this morning, media commentator Brian Edwards, listener columnist Bill Ralston and Investigate magazine editor Ian Wishart. Good morning to you all. Thank you for coming in this morning. Ian, if I could start with you. You had a criticism of the mainstream media saying there was no honest media coverage in the mainstream. What do you mean by that?
I think what I was looking for was a balanced debate. We're talking about redefining something that's existed for thousands and thousands of years as a natural human state, and that is for the creation of a family, that one unit comes together and creates kids. What we've done in the last 30 years is we've redefined that aspect of family behaviour. We've accepted a lot of different things. And one would have thought before we went the final whole hog and said, OK, this is now marriage, that we would look at the different lifestyles and say, is it appropriate, if we're going to say that, to bring kids into this equation as well in terms of adoption?
Well, was the Christian media, let's say Radio Rima, Shine and some of those other publications, were they any more honest than the mainstream media in their point of view? No. They
probably were, but they did not go probably to the depths that, say, Investigate did. We did a big article which we then sent to the MPs who were voting on the issue. But we were a lone voice. I mean, the Christian media have tried to to raise the issue, but it's become politically incorrect to do so.
And it's worth clarifying you are born-again Christian as well.
Yeah.
OK.
Well, if it's not covered in the mainstream media, there is something wrong with that, surely, isn't there? I mean,
well, it was.
We don't have to say.
The issue was debated in the mainstream media.
Well, obviously, Ian is saying it isn't. I mean, are you actually saying that the case against marriage of gay people was not presented at all in the media?
There were columns from occasional commentators saying this is wrong, and Rex Ardar was one example a couple of weeks ago. But there was no analysis of what is an essential matter of what is a gay-male relationship, and therefore do we say this is, when we switch on the marriage light and say all marriages are equal, we switch on the adoption light effectively and say all adoptions are going to be equal from now on as well. What my simple argument is you've got to compare the nature of the relationships, and that was not done.
Well, if there's a bias there, what's the reason for that bias? I
think it's purely cultural. This is a culture wars issue.
Well, I would suggest that maybe a lot of the mainstream media took the route that this is a human rights issue, not, you know, gay versus straight. OK, but then the argument comes down to, is homosexuality, lesbianism, innate? In other words, are we born with it, or is it a cultural artefact, as some gay academics are arguing? If it's a cultural artefact, it's no different from a political badge. I'm a Labour voter, I'm a National voter, I'm a New Zealand First voter, whatever. Are we legislating for choice instead of who we are? OK, let's just bring in a clip here that we have of Shine TV that was aired earlier this week.
The controversial marriage amendment bill has its third reading tonight, and proponents are confident it will pass into law. MPs voting against the bill say it's not about marriage equality, nor has there been enough debate around the rights of children. Family First's Bob McCoskrie suggested politicians don't even have a public mandate to redefine marriage.
Now, Shine, of course, is a religious channel run out of the Radio Rima stable, isn't it? But they talk about Bob McCoskrie there. Well, I saw McCoskrie in the mainstream media voicing his opinions all the way through. So if you look at the Pacific Island media, that took a pretty anti-gay marriage stance because it reflected the community that they are talking to. I know MPs like Sam Lotoliga had a real difficult time coming to the position he did, which was opposed to gay marriage, simply because his community was also opposed to it, and his local media took much the same sort of stance. I think there was a reasonably free debate around it.
I also don't know whether you consider Parliament as part of the mainstream media, but there was massive coverage of Parliament. I mean, the actual third reading must have been watched by more people than have watched almost any television programme in a long time. And I wondered if you watched that and whether you weren't moved by what you saw there, because I was.
I watched the second reading. I didn't bother watching the third reading because it was a fait accompli. But again, all of the platitudes, the truisms, the celebratory speeches and so forth don't count for anything in terms of hard facts. Is this relationship essentially equal in terms of how it creates a family structure? And the argument from gay academics around the world is no. I mean, Peter Wells is arguing similar things in the Listener this week about why he's not going to get married. I think that the media have not covered this in detail and not covered it well.
If you look at the polling that's been done over the years on the issue of gay marriage, there has been a considerable shift. people under the age of 30, and most of the polls are almost overwhelmingly in favour of gay marriage. People aged over 65 are almost overwhelmingly against. I think there's just a tide of history rolling through. If you say the mainstream media were biased against it or against your position, it's possibly because newsrooms these days are very young places with a lot of young faces.
I can shed some light on that. Back in the mid-80s, at the height of the AIDS scare, a couple of American advertising gurus and psychologists got together and said we need to come up with a plan that changes the way America and the world thinks about gays. And they set out a propaganda strategy, and they called it a propaganda strategy, very clear about getting into the media, positive portrayals in the news and on TV shows and in the movies and so forth, to change the way the public felt about gay people so that they accepted them as just like us next door. And they said you are not to broadcast details about our lifestyles. That will turn people off. Make them seem just like the people next door.
As part of the problem here is that it's a liberal, Western, secular country, and the media is representative of that. And then when we come to covering a Christian perspective, I mean, it's a minority view.
If you look at the online polls that the Herald did, and even TV3's Campbell Live, a massive majority of people
they're
opposed
not scientific.
to...
They're not scientific.
But they're huge volume polls, and if we're saying that TV3 listeners are overwhelmingly conservative, I'd be very surprised.
Well, let's have a look at... Let's have a look. I just took a look at the scientific polls. Herald Digipol, 52% in favour, 48% against. Courier poll, 47% in favour, 43% against. Herald on Sunday, a poll 54% for, 38% against. You look at the scientific polling, and it does tell you there is the shift in the way people are now looking at the idea of gay marriage. And yet, if you look at
the media coverage across both the Christian and the mainstream media, you wouldn't see a 50-50 debate level going on. You would see most of the media coverage, particularly the Herald, was very positive, very pro-gay marriage, and very supportive of it.
One thing that interested me was that although this was about human rights, to some extent this debate was framed in quite emotional terms. I mean, if you watch that third debate, for example, the commonest phrase the whole way through was loving couples, loving couples. So we heard a huge amount of loving couples. So I wonder if that's part of what you were talking about. So it became difficult for people to object to that. Because who wants to object to loving couples getting married?
And has done. I mean, I wrote a book 5 years ago, Eve's Bite, which looked into these issues, not just the gay issue, but a bunch of them, ideological ones. And I covered the PR plan out of the States on gay behaviour and how to change public attitudes. It was very much about that. It was promoting positive keyword phrases, that lizard brain phrases, they call them, that sit inside the public consciousness and become accepted. So what we've seen over the past 30 years is you've had a propaganda... You've been brainwashed. There's been a propaganda campaign.
Well, he agrees, you have been brainwashed.
Has anything changed in terms of gay lifestyles, gay behaviour in the past 30 years? Why have the public changed?
Just a greater level of acceptance.
Maybe the media is ahead of the public.
But why? But this is the question. What has changed?
I think it would have been very brave for any MP during that third reading to have stood up, other than Winston, pretty well, who is fearless, to have stood up and objected to all of that. When you listen to all those stories, which were enormously moving stories, of people who weren't doing all the horrible things you were talking about, it's very difficult to object to that, isn't it?
In PR terms, I mean, all of us here have experience in the dark arts of PR. And
I have no experience in those dark arts.
Neither do I.
Bill does, I do. And I worked as a press secretary in Parliament, but in terms of how you manipulate public opinion, you go by anecdote, and what we've seen here is a legislative change by cute and cuddly anecdotes.
You really think
the biggest
that the biggest
manipulator of public opinion is religion?
Not in this country anymore.
Oh, well.
Right. I want to now just change the tack a little bit. Someone who didn't vote for gay marriage was Jerry Brownlee, and we have an image of him. That's just as an aside, a little sachet there. We lifted this off his Facebook page. This is Jerry Brownlee at Moss Brothers in London, all dressed up and off to a funeral, Margaret Thatcher's funeral. And a morning suit. He's got a top hat under his arm.
Come on, he wouldn't have any choice. That would have been the dress de rigueur for that particular occasion.
I'm just amazed Moss Bros had a suit that size.
I do quite like his tie. He's very on trend with that colour tie, orange.
I didn't realise it was make fun of fat people Sunday.
But Ralston, we're looking at you.
I'm going to defend him. Yes, they were talking about him.
I think he does look very smart,
I think he looks great. He looks great.
He does.
Lovely colour of tie. What is that colour?
Apricot.
It's orange.
Apricot.
No, apricot's old-fashioned. Orange is on trend, gentlemen. You heard it here first. All right, we have to leave it there, but thank you all. Ian Wishart, Bill Ralston and Brian Edwards. Thank you.